My name is Carlos. I'm the president of the Bristol University Sustainability Team. I'm in the committee with Kaisa and some other members here. And yeah, thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. We have a decent number of people, especially during this time of the year. Yeah, I want to be brief because we have a really interesting panel that will talk about the IPCC in a post-COP26 context. Well, the BUST, the Bristol University Sustainability Team, is a student-led society, of course, at the University of Bristol. So this is just one of the many events that we host every year. Feel free to join us as a member if you are not yet, if you're a University of Bristol student. And also, please turn your camera on if you can, so that we can see you all. And especially write down your questions on the chat so that we can ask the panelists in the end. So we have the privilege to have Dr. Jo House, who is providing the evidence base for climate policy on climate change mitigation targets and land-based migration options. She's the former head of climate advice to the Government Office for Science, the UK Committee on Climate Science, and EU negotiators. We also have Professor Dan Lunt. He's understanding how and why climate change has changed in the past and how we can apply this in our future actions. And she founded the journal Geoscientific Model Development. We'll also hear from Dr. Joseph Daron. He's working on applied climate science, focused on the development of climate services and climate risk communication. He's a science manager in International Climate Services. And also Dr. Matthew Palmer works on the synthesis of the various components of projected large-scale sea level rise and modeling extreme sea level. He leads sea level and also heat content research, and they are all authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. For those of you that don't know yet what the IPCC is, don't worry, we'll learn about that right now. And just to clarify as well, there are 3 working groups, and they are all part of the working group number 1, except for Dr. Jo House, who is part of the working group number 3. But I will let them carry on with the presentations and the introduction to the IPCC. So Dr. Matthew Palmer, if you'd like to go first. I think that I will have to share my screen for the presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Carlos, and thanks everyone for joining. So we're going to skip back right to the start of the presentation, please. I think we're on the last slide here. There we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so as Carlos said, I'm going to give you a fairly brief introduction to what the IPCC is and roughly how this process works and why it's important for international climate negotiations, such as those that have taken place recently at COP26. So I'm based at the University of Bristol, of course, but I'm also based at the Met Office Hadley Centre here in Exeter. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is really the United Nations body that's responsible for assessing the science related to climate change. So it provides regular assessments of the scientific basis for climate change, its impacts and future risks, and options for adaptation and mitigation. And these large assessments are done roughly every 5 to 7 years. So it was established in 1988. And really the objective is to provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. And it's a key, the IPCC assessment reports are a key input into international climate negotiations. Next slide, please. So there are 3 working groups which deal with the different aspects. I think we may expand on these in the discussion, but the working group 1 report that many of us on the panel were involved with is really what's called the physical science basis. So really it explores the kind of physical changes in the environment that we might see. It includes both understanding of past climate change and also what change we might see in future under different emissions scenarios. It's important to realise that the Physical Science Basis Working Group 1 report really then feeds into the Working Group 2 report, which comes later, and the Working Group 3 report, which deal with impacts, adaptation and vulnerability and mitigation of climate change. So how we might change future emissions to kind of mitigate the worst effects in Working Group 3. There's also a task force on national greenhouse gas inventories, which is there really to monitor how national greenhouse gas emissions are evolving over time. So the Working Group 1 report was published a few months before COP in August. The Working Group 2 and 3 reports, sorry, there's a typo on that slide, will follow in February and March next year. Next slide, please. So here's a few numbers. I'm going to concentrate on the numbers on the right-hand side. So it's this is a 3-year process, and for the Working Group 1 report, 14,000 scientific publications were assessed. There were 78,000 public review comments, which were addressed over 2 different rounds of review, and 46 countries commented on the final government distribution, which is kind of toward the very end of the process. So this is a big undertaking by 234 authors from 65 countries. It's a big job. This happens over about a 3-year period. Next slide, please. So what does it really entail? So if we start on the left-hand side, there are 12 scientific chapters, which are all more than 100 pages long, dealing with the different aspects of climate change. Then all that science gets condensed down into the first of 2 kind of summary documents. So the first is called the technical summary, and that still retains a lot of the scientific content. It's still quite a long document, but then that is further distilled into the most important document of all, which is the summary for policymakers. So this is a much more condensed kind of document, which has to be agreed line by line with the 195 members of the IPCC. So there's 195 country delegations that agree the line-by-line wording with the scientific kind of representatives across the report. And the power of that document is it's been agreed by all those governments, and that's why it's so kind of important for the climate kind of negotiations which happen at COP events. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish with 3 of the key statements, which I think are kind of take-home messages from the Working Group 1 report. So recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. Next slide. It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall and droughts, more frequent and severe. So this was a real strengthening of the science, being able to connect the human greenhouse gas emissions to the sorts of extreme weather events we've been seeing more and more of in recent years. Next slide, please. So unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C will be beyond reach. And the 1.5 degrees refers to the Paris Agreement to try and limit future warming to 2 degrees, and if at all possible, to 1.5 degrees. So that's obviously very policy relevant. And then the last slide is just where you can find more information. And I'll leave it there, and I believe Dan is going to give some reflections on COP26 now. But that's the science background. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. So yeah, I'm just going to, before we go on, so I think all the panel members are going to give a few of the panel members are going to give some reflections on sort of the outcomes of COP and whether it was a success or not, and what the achievements were, if any, and what the disappointments were, if any. But before that, I thought I'd give a brief introduction to itself and what it means and sort of what the lead-in was to COP. So I'll just share my screen. So yeah, so COP26, well, I guess the name says it all in some senses. The fact that we're at negotiation meeting number 26 shows that this has taken a long time to get to this point. But I thought I would start off by giving a bit of context sort of before we went into these climate negotiations a few weeks ago, where we actually were, what was the state of play before COP started. Well, as Matt said, we had the Paris Agreement at 6 years ago, a previous COP, Climate of the Parties, where, as Matt said, the agreement was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5. Now, to put this number into some context, it's worth bearing in mind that we've already had 1.1 degrees of warming since a sort of background state before wide-scale industrialization started. So we're talking about, that is the situation where we are now. We've had 1.1 degrees out of a total, if you like, of the target of 1.5. To put that, you know, this is about warming, but what does that mean for people? Well, the World Health Organization has said that between 2030 and 2050, climate change on its own is expected to cause about 250,000 additional deaths per year from whether it's a combination of malnutrition, malaria, heat stress, other climate impact factors. So that gives you a scale of the issue that we're facing. But to put this in even more context, this map shows the globe, but the size of each country is related to the amount of emissions that each country has emitted, the amount of carbon that they have burnt since industrialization. And so you can see, for example, the size of the US, China, India, the UK in particular has a large contribution of global emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Just look at the size of Africa and the global south to put in context, you know, where this problem has come from. But when the World Health Organization talks about impacts, where are these impacts going to be felt? Well, this map shows that. This shows the size of each country now is in relation to where those climate impacts will be felt. And this is the other background going into these global negotiations, in that there is one set of countries who have caused the problem and another set of countries who will face the consequences, or the most dire of the consequences. Another bit of context going into these negotiations is that at the Paris COP, where this target was set, there was also put in place what we call a ratchet mechanism, where every 5 years the countries were ordered effectively to come back and update their pledges about how they were going to cut their emissions. And that's why this COP26 was sort of set to be a big one, if you like, is because it was the first COP after Paris where these pledges were due to be updated. Another bit of background is that there was a lot of discussion going around about what we call climate finance, and there are three sort of types of climate finance that are considered in these negotiations. The first of all is adaptation. How do richer countries pay for poorer countries' defenses against climate change, for example, flood defenses? Also about mitigation. How will the richer countries pay for the poorer countries in terms of transforming their economies to a greener economy, to helping with their energy transition? And then finally, and most controversially, and the one that caused the most discussion, is what we call loss and damage. And this is basically richer countries paying for either damages that have already occurred or damages that might happen as a result of climate change. And another bit of context is that there was some of this climate finance, and the scale of this climate finance was agreed previously, and this target of $100 billion a year put in place, but that has not been met. The richer countries have not met the amount of climate finance that they promised. So that was the context going into COP. what about COP itself? Well, it took place in Glasgow on 2 campuses, the so-called blue zone over here on this side of the river, the green zone over here. The blue zone was where the negotiations happened. The green zone was more about public outreach and communication with the public. There was also a third side of COP, really, which was on the streets of Glasgow, and that's where, where there was a lot of climate activism and protests and various things going on the streets. So it's these sort of 3 sides of COP. The blue zone itself was in various different components. There were so-called pavilions where each country had their own stand. In general, the size and flashiness of the stand was, sort of in proportion to their greenhouse gas emissions and whether they were an oil state. The Saudi Arabian stand was amazing. The so-called presidency programme was a series of talks put in place by the UK government, again, that were open to observers and other people, where there was a panel and they discussed various different issues. But then there were 2 other elements, the main negotiations itself. These happened behind closed doors, so I, as an observer, was not privy to those. That's where most of the negotiations happen. But every so often, these negotiations sort of bubble to the surface in these so-called plenary events, where all the countries would gather, and Alok Sharma from the UK, president of COP, would give his sort of State of the Nation address for that day, saying, this is what we've discussed so far, this is where the sticking points are, this is where we need more work, this is where it's going well. And then each country was able to then respond to that by talking about their wishes, if you like. And some of these talks were incredibly moving and emotional. I won't read through them all. You can, if you're interested, you can look at the transcript or go through this Twitter thread that I'll put in the chat. But just as an example, to give you a sort of feeling for the sorts of things that was said, in the Maldives, we have listened to disagreement on commas and full stops. We did not cause the climate crisis. Our islands are eroding and the saltwater incurses further and further. We are losing families and friends. From Ghana, the present generation has rented the world from the previous generation and we must pass it on. This is a moral obligation. A clear roadmap for mitigation goals is needed. Finance is very, very critical. Developed countries must make good on their pledges. And this shows that those were the real big issues that were sort of going on behind the negotiations. Just another 2 very tiny additional bits of context. In terms of the negotiations themselves, they tended to be there are 190 whatever countries involved in this. It would be chaos if they all spoke. So countries got into different sort of negotiating groups. Some countries are members of more than one group, and so actually it's quite a complex sort of network of different negotiating stances, if you like. And the aim of COP, if you like, was to produce an agreed statement that all the countries could agree to. And actually the wording of that is very, very important. I learned a lot in terms of what is more important, whether the UN instructs you to do something, or requests, or strongly urges, or invites, or recommends, or strongly encourages. All these words have very subtly different meanings that are recorded. So anyway, I just thought I'd give you a bit of context to the background of the COP as we went into it. And I think that now the panelists are going to talk a little bit on their reflections of some of the outcomes of that.
Thank you very much for the introductions to both the IPCC and the COP26. That was a great starting point to have some context on such an important report and conference. But yeah, we're gonna run on to the panel discussion now, if you like. And I would like to start by asking a general question about your main impression of the negotiations and outcomes of COP26. And perhaps Dr. Jo House might like to start, as she's working on the working group number 3, which is all about the climate adaptation.
Yeah, so actually on working group 3, so working group 2 deals a lot with impacts and adaptation as well. And Danny Schmidt from the university has been working on that. And Working Group 3, we do more stuff on impacts, but mostly on mitigation and climate solutions. And within that, I work on the AFOLU chapter, which is a horrible acronym that stands for agriculture, forestry and other land use. And just to say, on the build up to these IPCC reports, we also had 3 special reports that came out in the last few years, which was the IPCC special report on 1.5 that Dan Mitchell worked on, the one on climate change and land, which myself and Kat Michaelides worked on, and the special report on oceans, which Tony worked on. So there's been a lot of activity that built up to these IPCC reports, and a lot of information that was already a strong basis for this COP as well as previous COPs. And also, I just wanted to touch on the inventory reports, because I think they tend to get a bit overlooked in the IPCC process, because it's about number counting and, numbers and methods, and doesn't sound so exciting. But actually, the countries get very interested in this, because this is where they do their reporting and accounting of their greenhouse gas emissions. It's the methods they have to use. It's the numbers that will be counted. So in the end, although it sounds much more sort of sciencey, techy, it's actually really, really political, and the countries really engage on that. And we had an update to the reporting, and this comes in very much under one of the things that was agreed at COP, which was Article 6, which is part of the Paris rule book. So the Paris COP 2015 was great and inspiring, and lots happened that we didn't expect to happen, and it was incredible to be there. And the push towards 1.5 as an aspiration kind of came out of the blue, and that was something the developing countries really pushed on. And that's something that's remained a focus all the way through at this COP as well, which is brilliant. Paris brought in new rules, and there was a Paris rule book, which is essentially what Article 6 is about, what we would do. And it's taken until now lots and lots of up and down negotiations in order to get that in place. And I'm not going to cover the whole of that, but I think if I can pick on just one thing out of that I thought was really good, not only that it was agreed in Article 6, which focuses a lot on international carbon markets, but there was a key risk that was avoided around international carbon trading. So carbon markets mean that a rich country like the UK could buy offsets in developing countries, and that was always true under Kyoto Protocol, but the difference with Paris is that all countries will have set themselves targets, their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, and they all are obliged now to do regular reporting following the rules and the guidance that IPCC have developed in our Task Force for Inventories, in our good practice guidance. And so there's a risk actually when all countries start reporting of who claims that. If the UK buys an offset from Indonesia, does the UK claim that against our targets, or does Indonesia claim that against their targets? And so there were very strong rules put in to avoid that double counting. So that was one of my highlights I was very pleased about, because it is, we're talking large amounts of carbon potentially that, countries could claim and then not do emissions reduction, which is really what we want all the countries to do. So that was really good, that was agreed. For me, another highlight was a highlight and a disappointment, really. A highlight was the Forest Declaration. It was great hearing that come early on. I think I got into science 30 years ago and got into doing IPCC 25 years ago in the third assessment report, because I really cared about forests. So it's great to hear the Forest Declaration. But on the other hand, we already had the New York Declaration on Forests about 5 years ago, and it doesn't say anything. It says it's a little bit stronger than the New York Declaration on Forests, but not much. And the thing is, we haven't met any of the targets in the New York Declaration on Forest. So I think these things are really easy to say, and it's so fantastic to hear countries saying them, to hear really strong net zero, pledges from the countries. but we need to see action and policies in order for these things to actually come in place and not be blah, blah, blah.
Great point. If someone wants to carry on with this question, would be great. And I'm particularly interested in, as a follow-up question, to know about the level of ambition, if it was, aligned with the scientific community expectations.
So the pledges at Paris don't get us to 1.5 degrees. I can't remember what the climate action tracker, I put in Carbon Brief in the post, and I'll put a link to the climate action tracker too.
Yeah, I've got a graph that I'll show in. I've got a graph that I'll show in a minute that's just very interesting, that shows that, I think.
Great. I'm hoping, Dan, that your graph says 2.4, or if not, I'll just claim long COVID brain fog for getting the number wrong. But yeah, we don't make ambition, and I think this is a really interesting thing. When we were at Paris and the 1.5 thing was going around, if you actually talk to scientists on the floor, so the 1.5 and the Coalition for Ambition was happening, and when you initially started talking to their scientists about it, they were all like, "You got to be kidding! We're never even going to get to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. This is kind of crazy." And I think throughout the 1.5 report and throughout all of IPCC, and I have to say this is a personal opinion, that I'm not speaking as an IPCC author for a minute. There is a lot of doubt in the scientific community about whether 1.5 is even possible. But the point is that keeping it on the table makes it possible, whereas not keeping it on the table means it's definitely possible. And keeping it on the table also keeps 2 degrees more possible. So I would say that there's not, it's not ambitious enough. On the one hand. On the other hand, it's far more ambitious than I could have imagined pre-Paris, and even at Paris, where we've got to now, is far more ambitious than I could have imagined. And one of the other good things that came out of this COP was the agreement to do the ramping up, the raising of ambition every year instead of every 5 years. And that's really critical, because what we do now will really make a difference. It's a little bit like the COVID thing going on. Actually, if we take action now, we'll have a far fewer cases after Christmas. And it's very similar with climate. Anything we do now is likely to cost less and to be more effective. So I think that was a really, really major thing, that annual ramping of ambition.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that. Could I follow on with a few other achievements and disappointments?
Yes, please.
So I would say one major achievement was that actually this thing was signed at all. The fact that 197 countries agreed to sign this Glasgow Climate Pact, it wasn't at times during negotiations, it was not clear at all that would happen. So the fact that something was agreed, I think, was actually quite a major achievement. There was another thing we had, is that there were some of these pledges submitted, new pledges. So countries did do what they said they would do at Paris, which again wasn't always clear that would happen. Most countries did do that. And in a minute, I'll show you a graph of what that actually means, what those pledges mean in terms of sort of where we are in terms of that target. There was also some groups forming, so the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the so-called BOGA, the Under 2 coalition, were a couple of organized, groupings of countries that formed that might have some power and say in the future. There was a pledge to at least double the adaptation finance from 2019 to 2015. But one of the things for me as a scientist that was most pleasing about being at COP was that at no point in the whole time I was there and talking to other people, the other scientists, they said the same thing, is that no point was anyone questioning the science. There was no sort of climate skepticism there. I understand that some previous COPs, especially if we went further back in the past, there were groups of people handing out leaflets about climate skepticism and saying that, this is not happening, but there was nothing of that. And in fact, the IPCC science was really front and center in the agreement. The first half a page or so of the agreement was all about, pretty much echoed the main findings of IPCC. So that was very encouraging that science is now being accepted. I think what most people would say the failures were of COP were nearly all related to the finance side, and that the richer countries did not live up to some of the expectations that the poorer countries were going into. There was originally some text to set up a facility for distributing, a Glasgow loss and damage facility, as it was called, to allow countries to avert, minimize and address this loss and damage that I talked about earlier. But in the end, that was changed just to a dialogue mechanism. So in other words, it was just, they said we are going to discuss this for a bit longer. And that meant a lot of countries went home very disappointed. There was the first ever mention of fossil fuels in a COP agreement, but the wording around that was watered down slightly. And another final disappointment probably is that these commitments that the countries made was not enough to take us to this target of 1.5, but they were still quite significant. And I'm just going to, if it's all right, I'm just going to finish. I'll stop talking in a minute. I'm just going to finish with one graph. I'll just share my screen again because I think it is quite compelling, if you like. Is this one here. And so what this shows is what the temperature warming that we are expecting as a globe to hit, where we thought we were going in 2020. If you just took into account the commitments made by countries up to the year 2030, then we were looking at 2.6 degrees in 2020. What I mean is, in the year 2020, we were thinking that the temperature in the year 2100 was going to be 2.6 degrees above this sort of background level compared to the target of 1.5 or 2. Just before COP, that number was down at 2.4 because of additional commitments made. And after COP, it was 2.3. Okay, so you could say in that sense that COP made the difference of 0.1 of a degree towards this target. But that isn't the final story, because countries have also made commitments about when they will hit net zero. So when their carbon emissions will equal their carbon removal, if you like. And countries have said that they will do this by the year 2050 or 2060 or 2070 or whenever it is. And there's a question is whether you believe that this will happen. But if you believe that these targets will be met in future, then before COP, we were looking at a temperature rise of 2 degrees by 2100. After COP, it was 1.8. And so if we reach these long-term commitments and the short-term commitments, then we're looking at a temperature rise of 1.8, which is within this window of these two Paris targets. Okay, I'll pass on to someone else.
I think it's also important to know that there's a very high degree of uncertainty. Like we saw that before COP, we're talking about 2.6, but that could scale up into 3 degrees, which is horrible. And on just, through the lines of these statements, and I think that one of the most important questions would be about how we can, all take action on climate change. Specifically in this case, through research. I know that you are super, knowledgeable and experts in this side. So I believe that Joseph has some very interesting tool to show us about carbon.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos, and thanks everyone for joining the opportunity to speak at this session. So, I mean, just quickly reflecting on the previous question around sort of ambition meeting the what the scientific community has expressed is needed to meet these kind of levels of warming. I think just one thing that has been said, but I think it's really crucial as well, is that the atmosphere doesn't really respect policy pledges. And of course, what happens between the COP26 and actually what happens on the ground in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases and concentrations is absolutely key to what level of warming we have. So whilst we have the policy level, we have to expect there's going to be some gap between that and what happens in reality. So, but that's really important from an adaptation point of view. It doesn't take away the importance of reducing emissions, but it does mean that countries around the world, including the UK, adapting to climate change, have to realistically take into account those higher scenarios in planning. And the space that I work in climate services, both in my role at Bristol, but at the Met Office as well, I have a joint role with, similar to Matt, is about how we actually take action particularly around adaptation to climate change, and put in policies, plans now to adapt to what conditions may come in the coming decades. So in the IPCC, I had a more minor role than others, so I was a contributing author to two chapters, including on the Atlas chapter. And as part of that, the IPCC has developed a novel tool this time. So people think of the IPCC as big reports with heavy on text, but this time around there's also an interactive tool which allows anyone around the world, but is particularly aimed at those who are going to be using climate information potentially in research or in applications, to look at some of the data that underpins the assessment report and some of the key findings. So I'll just briefly share that. I'll share my screen now. So hopefully you can see this now. Is that my screen coming through?
Yes, we can see that.
Great. So yeah, if you go to the main IPCC website, then you scroll down, you'll come to the interactive atlas. And this, I'd love to say I developed this, but this was developed by partners in Spain and funded by the Spanish government, in fact. And what it shows, if you go on here, you've got 3 places. One is the regional information, then there's synthesis information, and then documentation, which kind of guides you how to use some of the information. There's also a cool spinning globe. I don't know if you can see that spinning, but you can click on the different warming levels and have a look and spin it around to see what the level of warming looks like. And of course, you have the kind of amplification over the Arctic. But just to show you, there's a simple version and an advanced version of this regional information. I'll just briefly show you this because this is the main kind of part of this interactive atlas. So I'll click on advanced. And what it will do is it will automatically show a map of the world with these different predefined regions. And you can select any of these regions, and the data from the climate model simulations that have been assessed in the IPCC, it provides you summary information. So for example, over Northern Europe, it brings up lots of different ways of visualizing that. And you can see time series of projections going into the past and observations. I'm not going to go into any detail of any of these pieces. It's more just a flag that there's a resource here now that is available. It even gives you the climate stripes for all of the climate models over Northern Europe, if you like climate stripes like I do. And also there's lots of data in here. So there's data sets for model projections, historical and observations, and paleoclimate runs as well, and a whole host of variables. So here showing temperature, but you can, for example, show total precipitation. And this shows you the kind of the synthesis of the model information. So I really just wanted to show this briefly and highlight that this is a resource that, you know, researchers who are interested in climate information can use. And there's a lot of guidance material on this main website, including a bit more about the assessment report and about how to use this interactive atlas. But I just thought it would be worth sharing because as well as the physical copies, and one of the nice bits about working in the IPCC is you get a physical copy of the summary of policymakers, but actually it's this other information which is really useful and can be further exploited for use in research to inform those kind of actions. So yeah, I'll leave it there and hand back. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you very much for showing us the IPCC Atlas. That looks very interesting, and please check that out on the IPCC website. And I think that we're just on time to jump onto the Q&A. We wanted to leave a very decent amount of time for people to ask, you know, directly to you any questions related to climate change and this project. So I think one of the first ones, we have many. Andy Wakefield is asking about the UK national legally binding targets. Who is held responsible if we miss those? And would it be governments who agreed them or governments who missed them? For example, who's in power for the 2030, 2050, etc., or both? If that makes sense. Yes, please, Dr. Joe House, you can go.
Yeah, so in case people aren't seeing the chat as well, we already had a question before about the Paris targets as well. So just in case people didn't see it in the chat, it's a kind of funny kind of legally binding, because it is kind of legally binding, but there's no legal enforcement mechanism, other than, you know, countries want to be seen to comply, or probably lots of deals. Probably a lot of what was achieved at Paris was because of deals going on behind the scenes that were nothing to do with climate change, that were to do with, well, if you make a stronger pledge on climate change, we'll do this for you that's nothing to do with climate change. So there's probably a lot of that kind of negotiation going on, and probably that will continue. But there is a global stocktake mechanism, and we're doing that in 2023, and that's where you look at the what the models say is necessary to stay within 2 degrees, and what the emissions reports produced by the countries under IPCC guidance methods, where that's going, and where we're going with pledges, and then you kind of look at what the gap is. That stocktake is done globally rather than on a country basis. So although countries will have to do their individual inventory reporting, and there is a international review process that looks at their inventory reports and hopefully makes sure that they seem accurate and reasonable. And then there will be a process, like Dan shared the link to Climate Action Tracker, where people like them, and probably part of the formal process as well, will look at individual country NDCs and compare them to where those countries are going. But when the global stocktake was negotiated at Paris, it was really clear that it was going to be a global stocktake, so not to individually look at countries and have a go at them or tell them whether they're doing well or bad, which is why we then end up relying on people like Climate Action Tracker to do that process, and the UNEP GAP report, because of this sense of concern about countries that they don't want to be individually picked up on. They're happy to have a global process, but not a process that says country A is doing well and country B is doing bad. That's part of a formal UN process. So as for national, we have our Climate Change Act, and that is legally binding, and where we're not meeting targets, then it's a whole parliamentary process that is meant to hold government to account for fulfilling its obligations. So that comes into things like the sort of cross-parliamentary groups and committees, like we're seeing at the moment with the cross-parliamentary health committee that is trying to hold government to account over coronavirus and whether it did what it needed to do. So then it would fall on the environment committee to be holding the government to account to say whether its policies are meeting that. And the Committee on Climate Change, along with the UK Government Department BEIS, which is Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, they do regular reviews of the country's progress, both on mitigation and adaptation, because we have adaptation targets as well. And so the National Committee on Climate Change and BEIS and DEFRA as well help review those, and then reports go back to government and it highlights where the gaps are. And then it's the job of Parliament to hold the government of the day to account on that. And just to touch on locally, Bristol was the first city to make a net zero pledge, to declare a climate emergency and to have a net zero pledge. And there's a whole process of that within the One City climate plans, and we also have a Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, and our job as an independent committee also is to hold the city to account for what it does. But what I want to say about that, and it maybe comes back to the point later about what we can do as individuals, action has to happen at all levels by all actors, and by actors I mean governments, businesses and individuals. And in Bristol, for us to achieve net zero, we're partly dependent on what national legislation is for what levers we can and can't pull, but also there's only so much which is within the remit of the council who made the net zero declaration, and that's why we need to bring all people within the city and communities and organisations on board with that, which kind of ties in with the whole Bristol City Climate Ask that's been launched as part of during COP. locally, there's no one to hold us to account other than all of you who pay taxes in the city to keep that pressure up. As well as kind of, you know, those of us who are trying to do it officially. But, you know, local councils have a lot of things to prioritise. Businesses have a lot of things to prioritise. They will prioritise those things if their electorate and if the people who buy their products insist. Therefore, you can hold action to account.
Thank you very much for such a great answer. I would like to ask the rest of the panelists if they would like to follow up with some other perspectives around who should, you know, be taking the lead in the face of the climate emergency and mitigating climate change in general. Perhaps Matthew Palmer, please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot with what Joe has just said. Basically, I think, I mean, my view is there is a role for both us as individual citizens, and there are all the standard things that always apply. We all have the right to vote. You know, we have collectively, we have a huge amount of power. I was reflecting back on what Dan Lunt was saying in terms of, and I think it's one of the causes for optimism in all of this. I think one of the things that stands in our favor at seeing action is I think that it's much more widely accepted now that climate change is here today. I think people basically get that. I think some of the extreme weather events that we've seen in the last few years have helped to really bring it into the public focus. There was a huge amount of press coverage when the Working Group 1 report was released. I think that momentum was kind of somewhat carried into COP26. And I think I think the background, I think people kind of get it now and they realize what's at stake. And so I think the mood has changed. It's interesting to think about whether our experience of COVID will kind of play into how people are prepared to change their lifestyles and things. We've all had to change our lifestyles during COVID without voluntarily doing so. But yeah, so I think there's, you know, the kind of things that Joe's talking about, you know, the fact that you can put pressure, I mean, on your government, both locally and on a national scale. And there are certainly lots of personal actions that you can take to try and help reduce your own carbon emissions. I think it's partly about getting used to the culture of you know, and kind of developing a culture. And I'm all for kind of grassroots initiatives that really don't wait for, you know, the kind of powers that be. I mean, yeah, I think we have quite a lot of agency as individuals and in influencing each other as well as a society, you know. But those are my reflections on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also realize, especially after so many post-COP26 events, the importance of, you know, referring to climate justice when we talk about climate change, when we talk about COP26, and all of these negotiations, we usually way too often, you know, leave too many people or too many countries behind. And I think that Patricia had a very interesting question about like, what are the main barriers that are stopping us from reaching goals in developing countries? Like, for example, not having enough data on the technical side of this issue. Would someone like to answer this question? Yes, please.
So yeah, I'll jump in. So I think, so my perspective, my experience certainly speaks more to the addressing climate risks and adapting to climate variability and change rather than the sort of transition to a green economy. But I see in my work working with scientific organizations in countries that the underpinning funding and the capacities is a continuous issue. And actually, what we're very lucky in the UK. We have lots of organizations, lots of researchers and active communities. It's still a huge challenge to you know, provide the evidence and make informed decisions, and obviously informed policy decisions. But in many countries, that kind of capacity is simply lacking. And I think there's a lot we can do and reach out, and we have a responsibility as well. I guess a moral responsibility is, being from a high polluting country historically, to support other countries. And I think this is an area where certainly, and again, reflecting on the kind of role of scientists and researchers, that we can really support and collaborate with organizations and help build capacity, but also put pressure and make recommendations for donors or governments to increase investment in capacities, so that both addressing challenges of climate change adaptation, mitigation, are able to be addressed.
And I think that's a very good point, as I think Lunt mentioned earlier, like the Annex 1 countries, so the most developed countries, didn't fully commit to the $100 billion a year funding to the global south, essentially. And, that was a very, very big, barrier, I think. And in many cases, we tend to refer to climate finance as one of the most important mechanisms to achieve, climate justice and mitigate climate change. And I think because, especially young people, we've seen the how the youth is slowly, getting some voice, and we're the future, and we are being very noisy lately. And we tend to think that we don't have that much time. We are not too optimistic, and this is a growing trend, I think. And I agree with Annabelle. I would like to ask you this question as well. If you think that, given the circumstance at this point, we should not only recommend, as Joe was saying, but also charge or hold legally accountable those politicians or global leaders for not doing or for doing the detrimental effects on the environment and responding to the reviews in the UK, for instance. And also, if someone has a question, please raise your hand if you want to, speak as well, instead of chatting. Someone like to reply this question? It's a bit more towards politics and ethics, I guess. Otherwise, do you want to say something, Joe?
No, I was just going to say again, there's been some really useful things in the chat and responses, but I'd just like to emphasise about the importance of bringing together not just the climate, the whole process on climate change, but there's a similar process on biodiversity, and there's also the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the point someone made about well-being, it is really important to look at what we do, and not just well-being of people, but well-being of the planet, and to bring together solutions. And at a time where there's a big rush for solutions, climate justice and well-being have to be key. And whether that's, thinking about people working in the coal industry that may lose their jobs, and environmental justice around supporting them into other businesses, whether that's around making sure mitigation doesn't mean that, someone over here is buying a load of forest in Indonesia and ignoring the community use of the forest. That, there's all kinds of issues that really need to be considered, that in the dash for net zero, that we have, and all the carbon trading, that we have proper, really sound policies in place to ensure that we don't have these perverse mitigation and perverse adaptation where you might do good for climate, but you actually do something that's very harmful for people or for other species. And I think that's critical. And I think at the moment, just looking what's going on in the UK with and other places with carbon markets, we're in a bit of a wild west, where lots of companies are making net zero pledges, and they're desperately looking around to buy up bits of forest or pay farmers for carbon storage in soils and doing all sorts of things. But we've got to ensure that the rules around that are sound, and that they look at these wider non-climate, full societal and environmental impacts. So it's kind of like the COP was great, but the work's only just beginning. We've got lots of work to do to ensure that it still happens well.
Yeah, and I fully agree with Joe. I think there's a huge role at a city and local. The Bristol's mayor runs a meeting every 6 months, I think, where several issues are discussed. And the last one, it was a focus on climate change, and lots of local organisations all talked about what they were doing for the climate problem and to target Bristol's 2040, is it, Joe, or 2030? 2030 net zero.
2030, I believe.
Commitment, and there was some really, which is going to be a huge challenge, but yeah, we'll see. It's a classic example of whether a politician's promise will actually happen. But there was some really interesting stuff coming out there. So, like, for example, the NHS in Bristol is now insisting that all its supply chains are net zero. And so as a result, what that means, by doing that, they have huge buying power. And so what it means is not only do they have net zero pledges for themselves, but also for everyone who supplies all their resources and everything that they use. And so big individual organizations can actually have a huge reach outside just themselves. And I think the university is one of those organizations. And, I do think the Bristol University could be doing more in terms of its commitment to net zero and bringing down its emissions as soon as possible.
Well, that's a very, very interesting point, because I'm coincidentally working at the university to not only in the energy side, but especially on the education side. So I wanted to ask you as well, on a more personal level too, because that's one of the main reasons why I'm here today, because I read the IPCC back in high school, and I realized how devastating the situation was. I know that climate change was important, but I realized, the intensity and the severity of this issue. So as a very last question, I think that we have time for this. What do you think the role of education should be, or what do you think that we are, the formal education? We've organized these informal events, and I think that people are learning a lot, at least myself. But what do you think about, the curriculum in terms of, again, educating for climate change and sustainability?
I have to say, actually, that I was a little bit disappointed that in the COP, I've been ill with long COVID, so I've been a bit out of it for the last 20 months, really, and only just back at work, and so didn't attend Glasgow and wasn't as able to get involved with the efforts of the university at the COP. And the university did put a lot of effort in terms of communication at the COP and around the COP, and lots of cabinet briefings, which I would suggest you could have a look at. But where I think we really missed the trick was to do some really good cross-curricular education events, and I really wanted that and pushed for it, and then was ill, and so couldn't really follow it through, because I think in that, but that's something that we could look at in the university going forward. I think it would be a great opportunity, because I sit in geography along with Joe and Daron. Matt, I'm not quite sure what department you're in, but I know across people who have been involved directly with IPCC, it crosses all departments. And actually, when you're talking about climate change, when we look at why it's gaining a momentum, a lot of that is to do with the arts. And a lot of the things that are powerful at COP are things like poetry and art and filmmaking. There's a lot in the historical context that we can understand of what's happened with other environmental agreements. There's a lot in terms of behavioural science. There's a lot in terms of justice and social sciences. There's even within archaeology and understanding what's happened in the past and how people have behaved. This isn't a thing that's just to do with physical science. It's so cross-curricular, and I think it would be really important to involve across all curriculars and do some cross-curricular teaching would be amazing. And I know that the the Education for Sustainable Development Department and Chris Priest and others have been really doing some good work in this area. And I would love to see the university at the higher level supporting this and supporting us to really, really do cross-faculty teaching.
I will definitely take your feedback because that's my mission for this year, to embed sustainable development in the curriculum. And I think that we're just running out of time. I'm really grateful for everyone's presence here, for the great input. I've learned a lot on top of what I already knew. And if the rest of the panelists would like to share some final comments before we close this Zoom call, please just go for it. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say thanks to those who have attended. Thanks to you guys at BUST for organising this. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think the main thing with climate is to keep talking about it and have those conversations. I think that's the main thing I would say in closing.
Yeah, as a collective body, students are incredibly powerful and can have a real influence on politics, local and national level. So I think there's, as Matt said and as other people have said, keep talking, keep discussing, keep raising these issues, and you can eventually have influence way outside your own individual sphere. And also to say thanks very much to some great questions in the chat as well. It's been interesting looking at those as well. So thank you for those.
Yeah, just say a couple of additional things. Just want to highlight that obviously the Working Group 1 report of IPCC came before COP26, but is now going to be followed, it's already been mentioned, by the Working Group 2 on impacts and adaptation, and then the Working Group 3 that Joe's involved with next year. So I'm pretty sure climate won't go away from the headlines, but it is important that dialogue continues. And I've learned a lot from this event, and joining as a panelist always seems funny. I've got to make, I know what I know, but this everyone here has a lot of knowledge on this topic, which is wide ranging. So we need to keep on learning from each other and sharing. But yeah, thanks for putting this on and yeah, for allowing me to contribute.
Great, thanks to you all again. And yeah, I would like to start thinking about further events related to this. I think that they are very powerful and not too hard to organize, to be fair. So I think we have the second and third working group reports in February and March, respectively. Okay, I will take it up on those. Maybe we can, open them again all together. But I think that's all. We're 5 minutes late, but that was brilliant. Thank you again to everyone that joined, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.